eating disorder prevention. And along the way, I did a little bit of time on clinical and I found WIC. And the WIC bug just bit me, and I started with WIC back in 2011 at a local agency. I was a registered dietitian at Mountain Park Health Center, WIC, for approximately 8 years. And then in 2017, I made my way over to the state WIC office, and that's where I sit now. Um, and so I get the privilege to talk to you today about how we can try to make shift happen in our program and our approaches, and really applying that weight inclusive lens to practice, specifically in the WIC setting. So. All right. So throughout this presentation, I just want to emphasize why this work matters. And because we know, despite all of the progress that has been made towards recognizing weight stigma, weight bias, working to dismantle it, we still have those high rates of weight stigma across healthcare. And with that comes an increased risk of disordered eating. There's an impact on engagement, trust, and outcomes, and just an overall need for weight inclusive approaches to participant services. So a little bit about what I hope you can take from this presentation today. We are going to talk about the definition of weight stigma and kind of make those connections between how it contributes to things like disordered eating, healthcare avoidance, and poorer health outcomes in general. I also hope that we can discuss practices that reinforce weight bias, assess how food insecurity, trauma, history, and cultural factors enhance nutrition, integrate weight inclusive counseling strategies into practice. I hope that you leave with things that you can take and implement today. And then last but not least, certainly is identifying warning signs of disordered eating and making sure that you have those strong referral pathways in place. All right. So the public health in me, this is a story that you may be familiar with. I feel like we hear this story sometimes in public health when we talk about systems and prevention, and it's the story of the river babies, and I'll just read it aloud. So one summer, in the village, the people in town gathered for a picnic. And as they leisurely shared food and conversation, somebody noticed a baby in the river, struggling and crying. The baby was going to drown. Someone rushed to save the baby, but then they noticed another screaming baby in the river. And then they pulled that baby out. Soon, more babies were seen drowning in the river, and the townspeople were pulling them out as fast as they could. It took great effort, and they began to organize their activities in order to save the babies as they came down the river. As everyone else was busy in their rescue efforts to save the babies, two of the townspeople started to run along the shore of the river. "Where are you going?" shouted one of the rescuers. "We need you here to help us save those babies." "We're going upstream to stop whoever is throwing them in." And I actually first heard this story when I was at Grand Canyon University pursuing my graduate degree. And clearly, it really resonated with me in the work that we're doing. And so, this is just kind of like my overarching philosophy is that we can not only treat the downstream symptoms, so we know that we see things like weights, labs, behaviors, but we must also strive to identify and address those upstream drivers. So we're talking about stigma, trauma, food insecurity, systems barriers, all of these things. All right, so let's talk a little bit about weight stigma and define what it is. So, weight stigma is weight-based discrimination arriving as a result of dominant culture attitudes and beliefs held about individuals or groups of people based on their body, based on their weight, their shape, their size. And we know that this exists. We've heard personal stories of it existing. We're also seeing data that supports that this exists. And here is a blatant example of weight stigma. So you'll see here that a patient is coming in and saying, Doctor, I've been impaled. And the doctor just kind of dismisses the patient and says, well, maybe you'll feel better if you lose weight. And it's not just limited to physicians and telling patients with pain to lose weight before completing proper medical workups. Um, so that's just something to know. And it results to poor health outcomes because they may be coming in for something and the doctor or practitioner or physician or whoever is treating this patient or providing care is not providing the appropriate level of care. A little bit more about weight stigma. And these statistics are pretty sad. But 40% of adults, these are just the adults that share their experiences and that were part of the survey from the National Eating Disorder Association. But 40% across all body sizes report experiencing weight stigma. And in a study of 2,400 women, 72% of participants reported experiencing weight bias from family members.
Carl.
We have 69% of higher weight people report being stigmatized by doctors, and 52% reported doctors stigmatizing them on more than one occasion. Dietitians, I'm one of them, and they are more likely to label patients in fat or larger bodies as non-compliant or lazy. And research shows that negative attitudes towards higher weight children begin as early as preschool, age from 3 to 5 years old. Research shows that body shaming and anti-fat bias actually leads to weight gain. And 79% of binge eaters who internalize and blame themselves report more frequent binge eating to cope. So weight stigma, leads to less frequent pursuits of healthcare and seeking behaviors and is linked to increased mortality. So pretty detrimental and damaging. So a lot of public health policies tend to be focused on obesity prevention, and it's really time to reconsider the potential harms caused by this because of all of the data that I presented on how detrimental weight stigma and bias is on the previous slide. We know that when we focus on weight, people tend to avoid going to medical offices for routine care. Why would this be any different? And so we don't want, what I mean by that is we don't want WIC to become the place where they avoid seeking care or seeking resources because of that fear that they're going to be stigmatized because of their body. So it's just an unintended consequence. When we focus too much on weight through policies and programs, um, it can lead to stigma, like I mentioned, body dissatisfaction, dieting, disordered eating, and even death from its effects of extreme dieting, anorexia, and weight loss surgery complications, or from bullying that results from weight-based bullying. So a little bit about eating disorders and disordered eating. So eating disorders affect at least 9% of the population worldwide. And it's actually way underdiagnosed. A lot of people that have eating disorders never actually get diagnosed as having an eating disorder. And we'll talk a little bit more about that throughout the presentation. But eating disorders are among the deadliest mental illnesses, second only to the opioid overdose epidemic. And 81% of 10-year-old children are already afraid of being fat. Like I said, only 6% of people with eating disorders are medically diagnosed as underweight. And we have 10,200 deaths each year are the direct result of an eating disorder. That's one death every 52 minutes. And only 10% of people with eating disorders ever receive treatment. And so they're underdiagnosed. And even with those that are known to have eating disorders and be formally diagnosed with them, only 10% actually receive treatment. We know that binging and purging behaviors are more common among Black and Latino women than white women. And high body dissatisfaction and unhealthy weight control behaviors were more common among low-income girls. So these are the signs of and symptoms of eating disorders. And my favorite dietitian would always say, if you think that you don't work with people with eating disorders, you do. They may not be aware of it, they may not feel safe with you, but here are some things that you can look out for. And I just want to point out on this slide how only one of these signs and symptoms is related to weight. All of the other signs and symptoms are related to other things other than weight. So a lot of times people incorrectly correlate the two, and it's actually a really poor indication of whether there's an eating disorder or not. We're going to talk a little bit more about screening tools that you can utilize to help you identify if a participant may be at risk for an eating disorder a little bit further in the presentation. So this is why we care. The populations we serve are more likely to have eating disorders, to engage in dangerous eating practices, and they may need us to help. So 42 million people in the US experience food insecurity on a regular basis. And people who experience food deprivation are more likely to engage in disordered eating behaviors. People who experience food insecurity are more likely to binge, purge, misuse laxatives, and skip meals. And high food insecurity is more likely linked with increased body image concerns and increased experiences of weight stigma and bias. So this leads us to talk about how eating disorders are a public health issue. It does impact the WIC population, and therefore eating disorder prevention is a public health responsibility. So I heard somebody talking about earlier how, a lot of times WIC does have a lot of responsibility in the public health space, but with that responsibility comes a lot of privilege that we are in this position to touch so many people. So why eating disorder recognition matters. So eating disorders, like I mentioned before, have the second highest mortality rate of all mental illnesses, and they're often missed in people in bigger bodies, adults, BIPOC communities, and parents. And many clients won't meet the textbook stereotypes. And because of that, less than 10% of people with eating disorders receive treatment. Early recognition and compassionate referrals are definitely going to lead to better outcomes. So some common myths, I feel like I have touched on this, but I hope that I can continue to emphasize this point, is that weight, like you saw on that slide with the signs and symptoms, weight is only one sign and symptom. There are many other signs and symptoms, and there's a lot of myths when it comes to eating disorders that sometimes delay detection and referral. Some of those myths include that eating disorders only occur in thin teens. You can tell just by looking at them, or it's just about vanity or dieting. And really, the truth is that we know that eating disorders occur in all body sizes, genders, cultures, and ages. And disordered eating often starts under the guise of health. So I mentioned before some signs that you can look for in appointments. And so there's behavioral signs that you can look at. So rigid good food, bad food rules, fearfulness around meals or food groups, eating in secret is a big one. Constant body checking, which means looking at different parts of their body in the mirror, measuring, weighing. Often that's kind of what the definition of body checking is. Frequent bathroom use after meals, um, compensatory exercise patterns, and extreme distress if the routine changes. Some language cues that you might hear during appointments is I feel guilty when I eat. I earn this meal, or I need to earn this meal. I have to burn this off. I'm so bad for eating that, and I don't deserve to eat today. So sometimes when people bring up these sensitive topics, it can be difficult to know how to lead the conversation or respond. And so I always just tell people use gentle, permission-based language. So just, as we do in WIC, I feel like we're pretty good at this, but just asking, would you be open to talking about your relationship with food? Do you ever feel out of control around food? Do certain foods bring up guilt or anxiety for you, or have you ever felt the need to compensate after eating? And then just pairing it with an affirmation, such as, like, thank you for trusting me with that. That sounds really heavy to carry alone, or you deserve support with this. And I will say, as intuitive as these sound, it's helpful to practice saying these or role playing these statements because sometimes in the moment, it can be difficult to know what to say. And you may be afraid of, what do I say? What do I not say? How can I help? How can I offer that reassurance? So definitely practicing ahead of time is helpful. And then when to refer. So if the client, expresses distress or shame related to food or their body, if they have physical symptoms that I showed you on the slide before that could be related, if you feel out of scope, if there's evidence of purging, restriction, a binge purge cycle, or they ask for help, definitely refer. And this is just a way that you could bridge that referral. So what you shared with me is really important. I appreciate your honesty. Many people go through this and you don't have to handle it alone. I'd like to connect you with a specialist who can support you in a deeper way. Would that be okay with you? And then who to refer to? I mentioned before that having that like network is going to be really important. Definitely the primary care provider is a great place to start. Also, the National Eating Disorder Association website is helpful. The findedhelp.com, an eating disorder specialized registered dietitian, and then, of course, the National Suicide Prevention Hotline, which is 988 if they are immediate risk. And then just a little bit more about your role and boundaries. So what you are and are not. So you are a safe person, a bridge to care, a trusted voice, and you can be a myth breaker, really challenging some of those things that they think about food and their relationship with food and their body. Just kind of grounding them in, okay, well, what is true? And but you are not their therapist, their diet rule maker, the food police, or responsible to fix it all alone. So let's talk a little bit more about interventions that we potentially use that do likely cause harm. And it was really hard for me because I feel like when I was early on in my career, I did do some of these things because I felt like that was kind of the curriculum that was taught at the time. And I wasn't as educated as I should have been. Even though I had my past lived experiences, I knew that these things impacted me negatively. My dietetics curriculum at the time just kind of reinforced that this was like what you do as a dietitian. So teaching curriculum on good foods versus bad foods, um, weighing patients, recommending calorie counting for weight loss, and then using the body mass index as an indicator of health. And I want to spend a minute on the BMI because I want to just talk a little bit more about where that came from. And that was actually the BMI. How many of you are familiar with the history on the BMI? So the BMI was actually, the body mass index was actually created by a mathematician. So it was created based off of a mathematician's observations of white adult males. And so it had nothing to do with health when it was created. And somewhere along the line, we used this mathematician's work to kind of assign values to interpret it and determine whether or not, people were healthy or not based off of their BMI. And it really is like a flawed indicator of health for many reasons. But, you know, people of different, like we are all different. You could have two people eat exactly the same thing day in and day out, and their bodies would still look different because we genetically are different. We come from different cultures, different backgrounds. We are just different people. So the fact that we kind of use this body mass index to classify people, um, it just feels like we're missing the mark. All right, so let's talk a little bit more. I also like to talk about Alan Satter's hierarchy of food needs, because this is kind of the basis for um, eating. And so first, it needs to start out where people have enough food, right? They need to have enough food. There needs to be food that's accessible and available to them. And once that happens, then they're able to move into a space where they're able to decide whether food is acceptable or not. So now that I've secured that I have access to food on a regular basis, now I can decide if the food is acceptable to me or not. Then there's reliable, ongoing access to food, and then people start to develop more preferences for food. I don't always have to eat the food that's available to me because I have more access to food, so I can choose foods that taste good to me too. And then building on that, there's novel food. So because I have reliable access to food, I'm not going to be afraid if I try something new, a novel food, and I don't like it. Because I know that even if I try it, I don't like it, I still have access to other foods to meet my needs. And then there's instrumental food, which is when you're eating functionally for wellness, eating a certain food because you know that it's good for your heart or good for your gut or different things like that. And so I always like to share this with people because sometimes I feel like as nutritionists and dietitians, we're put in this place where we are working with clients that struggle with the bottom of the pyramid, which is they don't even have access to enough food. And then we're coming at the end at the top of the pyramid telling them, eat new foods, try something you haven't tried before, eat for your health. And until we address that bottom of the pyramid, we are not going to be successful in our interventions because we have not taken care of that minimum basic need. So I always like to remind people of that, of when they're stepping into counseling, is to consider where they're at on their hierarchy of food needs when you're approaching them with recommendations, because maybe we do need to just start with, do you have access to enough food? And that can be, you know, groundbreaking. We don't always have to, you know, I think that sometimes we like to hit the goal and mark it off and feel like we got to win and feel like our participant got to win, but having access to food is a win too. And that leads me to trauma-informed approaches. So we've done some work around this here in Arizona and just kind of really making sure that staff are familiar with the Center for Disease Control. Identifying early adverse experiences is a significant factor impacting health. And I'm going to tie this all together for you, but early trauma can have a lifelong effect in almost all areas of functioning. So if we know physical and emotional health, relationship abilities, ability to learn, employment capacity, and tying it to the work that we're doing, there's three different realms of ACEs. And one is things that are, going on within the household. Two are things going on in the community. And really wanting to highlight here that food scarcity is trauma. Food scarcity is trauma, poor water and air quality, um, and then it also shows environmental factors that can happen as well. So knowing that, we have participants that are experiencing trauma because of inadequate access to food, and then maybe they're being counseled or stigmatized for their body size or their food choices. It just adds on the layers, right? So some forms of food and nutrition related adversities, I already mentioned the limited access. Also historical trauma and cultural oppression. Um, you know, we have seen that some cultural foods have been kind of villainized. These well-meaning um, providers come in that are not educated and culturally competent and are kind of demonizing foods that are really culturally significant and important to people. We know that there's bullying or stigma around appearance, weight, or use of food assistance. I know that in Arizona, when we were on checks, um, stigma around using the checks in the grocery store was huge for WIC participants. And wanting to have their food list not stand out and be like, I'm receiving WIC, having it be like a more discreet food list. And so now we have, the things on the phone and EBT. We also have a history of disordered eating patterns or eating disorders for self or loved ones, bullying, teasing, or shaming one's food choices, adverse events or experiences surrounding particular foods, and foods being used as a punishment or reward. So I've talked a lot about the things that are problematic, but there are seeds of change and there's things that we can do to shift what's currently happening. And some of you are probably already doing this work, which is incredible. But I'm here to talk to you today about an alternative approach to the old way of doing things. And I really want to talk about weight neutral approaches today with you and just kind of give an overview and some practical applications. So, why weight inclusive counseling matters. So, when I give this presentation to medical providers, I just like to remind them of, as practitioners, as providers, we're first here to do no harm. And we know that weight stigma is harming people. It creates a barrier to care, trust, engagement. We know that there's impacts on mental health, avoidance of care, and physiological stress. And weight inclusive counseling improves outcomes, and we don't need to focus on weight. Um, it aligns with trauma informed and patient centered care models, kind of addressing and encompassing everything that I talked about before. So, what is a weight inclusive approach? So, it's going to prioritize those health behaviors over weight outcomes. In fact, it doesn't even talk about weight outcomes. And it recognizes the weight is influenced by genetics, hormones, medications, trauma, and access. It is not the individual's responsibility. It focuses on dignity, respect, and autonomy. And most of you are probably familiar with health at every size. And so weight inclusive approaches are rooted in that conceptually. And then it's also a blend of motivational interviewing and trauma-informed care. So where to start? So it always starts with self-work. Um, and there is a really great Harvard implicit bias test that you can take around weight stigma to see if there's any areas that you maybe it may be a blind spot for you. And so then you can be really intentional in focusing on that area. Commit to the long term. It's going to take time, right? And then practice self-care. I feel like when I first started doing this work, I was so passionate about it. It was so frustrating when I had to talk to others who maybe, whether it be a provider or somebody still kind of leaning on that weight-centric approach. And so, really practicing self-care, recognizing that change takes time. And as long as we're continuing to have conversations with one another about this, there continues to be an opportunity to um, shift what, we're doing. Connect to other organizations and people doing this work and learn from other practitioners. So I had a few fantastic colleagues that I worked with, one in Snap Ed that I really was able to connect with her and see what the work looked like in her space, but then also connect with, I had an eating disorder dietitian that I worked closely with, who was community based that, wanted to connect and, we just kind of all would like learn from one another to see what's happening in our space and then recognize how we could bridge any gaps, between the different work that we were all doing within our circle of influence. So just like I said, this approach is a blend between health at every size conceptually, motivational interviewing, and then trauma-informed care as well. So we do kind of talk about the core principles of trauma-informed communication, such as safety, peer support, empowerment, voice and choice, trust and transparency, collaboration and mutuality, and then cultural, historical, and gender issues. So SAMHSA is a really great resource. They have a lot of information on trauma-informed approaches to communication, and this is kind of just like that high-level overview. But I would really say to tap into some of the work that they're doing because it is fantastic. And then I believe that Noelle, who is one of my coworkers, already came and spoke to you about this incredible resource that was created, but it's called The Language of Health. And I think that we actually sent it out in the introduction email today, but it is a phenomenal resource that you can use for effective public health messaging strategies. That's what it's tested for, is it's tested for like a broader audience. But I will say that when I really started to do this work, I used it as a resource for a counseling framework, even though it's not tested in that way. There's a lot of great framing that can help you with like weight inclusive phrasing, how to adapt materials, how to avoid moralizing language, and how to validate client experiences. And so I took a screenshot here. There's 6 different sections in the language of health. But I took a screenshot specifically on nutrition because we're here to talk mostly about nutrition today. And this is the table that's in that section that just, what to say, what not to say. So just, all foods are good foods, um, sharing evidence-based nutrition strategies, eating patterns that fit within someone's lifestyle. Healthy lives lead to healthy bodies, and then promoting intuitive approaches to eating. And then just things to avoid, kind of that good food, bad food mentality, popular but unscientific strategies like the detox type stuff, short-term diets, weight loss maintenance leads to healthy bodies, and then promoting a controlled strategy of eating are all under like the things to avoid. And then I went to this really phenomenal presentation. I believe it was in Oregon. And they talked about strength asset framing is a really powerful tool. And I loved it. And I think it fits in really well with strengths-based counseling and practice. And so it's where you shift from the deficits to the capacities and focusing on what clients are doing. So examples are what's been working for you lately. What is one strength you bring to your health? I can tell how deeply you care about your health and your family. You're really in tune with your body. You get to decide what feels right to you. And then this is a very human response to stress and change. So just a sample script for weight inclusive counseling is sometimes like before it helps if before you even have but as you start the interaction. And so just saying before we get started, I want you to know my goal is not to focus on weight. I feel like if I was coming in as a participant, that would just take a huge weight off my shoulder. I'm here to support your overall health. Would it be okay if we talked about your energy, stress, sleep, and relationship with food today instead of weight? That is just like so incredibly validating as a human being to know that you're more than just like your body size and that this provider or this person that you're talking to like truly cares and truly wants to know what's going on with you. And so that's just a really thoughtful way to kind of frame the conversation. So talking about this a little bit more, talking about shifting the focus. The language of health does a really great job of explaining that health is multidimensional. So when we talk about shifting the focus, we're talking about health beyond the scale. And you can do this, you can help to like influence providers in your that you interact with, you can help them to expand their thinking by giving them examples of non-weight related outcomes. So, what is the blood pressure pattern? What is the A1C or glucose trend? How is the mobility and joint comfort? What are the energy levels, mood and sleep, food security and confidence? Around being able to, prepare meals, and then medication tolerability. So all things that, in my opinion, and I guess not just in my opinion, but we know are way more important than focusing on weight, right? So I've already throughout the presentation shared some resources that can help you do the work. Like I mentioned before, we have our Arizona Department of Health Services Language of Health that I would strongly encourage you to read through. SAMHSA has guided a lot of our work at the department and within the Arizona WIC program around implementing like trauma-informed communication strategies. Leah's Pantry has a lot of great curriculums and trauma-informed PSE trainings. And then I also asked Ellen if we could send out the Hayes Health data sheets because we have seen that a lot of participant materials that are created by other organizations can have some stigmatizing language regarding weight. And so the Hayes health sheets are really weight inclusive health sheets for different medical conditions. I also asked Ellen to include the Arizona WIC Power of Our Words resource guide, and we actually have a online self-paced course that WIC participants in Arizona can take. But then we also have this resource guide, which is meant to be kind of like a nutrition education reinforcement material, but it can also help you maybe guide some of your counseling, or if you have a curriculum that you're working on, I feel like it's a helpful outline. And then there's different training opportunities. So I mentioned that I had a really great collaboration with a eating disorder dietitian in Arizona, Taylor Asand. Ellen Satter, of course, the division of responsibility and the hierarchy of food needs that I shared with you. She has a lot of great books and materials if you're interested in learning more. Leslie Shaling, and then Michelle May is really doing a lot of work in the space of intuitive eating. And we've had her come and speak before on intuitive eating and how to incorporate intuitive eating approaches into counseling. And then, of course, we always strive in public health for like the big P wins, right? The big policy or systems or environmental wins. So just, in your space, taking a look at your equipment and your seating and making sure that you have weight inclusive seating and equipment. Neutral scale practices, asking permission, or even offering an optional blind weight where the participant is able to turn around to step on gate. That can be really great and useful tool for many people. Having inclusive forms and imagery, having all bodies on your different, posters or images, really, that's a really mindful and powerful way to make people feel like they're welcomed. And then, of course, committing to continuous learning and having those conversations with community partners and having those conversations with folks that my challenge that I always love is having conversations with those folks that maybe are practicing in a way different than I am, or have a different opinion, or they're still using weight-centric approaches. Really having like conversations with them, and trying to get down to like where do we share like where's our common ground, and how can we kind of start to shift the conversation towards, okay, you do want to be effective. Do you know that some of these approaches that you're using are actually not effective and causing more harm? Um, so just being committed to continuing to do the work. And with that, we are at the end of the time. So I wanted to see if anybody had any questions or thoughts or anything that they wanted to share.
Thank you so much, Emily. This was a wonderful presentation and so many important statistics and lots of practical advice and great examples of participant-centered messaging. So I look forward to reviewing your slides more and we'll certainly share them to all of you on the call today. But yes, any questions or comments for Emily?
Yeah, somebody said, I wish we didn't use BMI and WIC. And I get that. I feel like we had a conversation at a few of the National WIC Association meetings about BMI. And hopefully starting to like open up that conversation, like I said, and shift some of the focus. So, well, thank you so much for inviting me. Oh, did somebody unmute?
Yeah, this is Kristen. Hello. I am not a dietitian. I just get to hang out with them. I am on the research side, but we here at Oregon WIC, we talk a lot about cultural foods, and I really piqued my attention when you were talking about potential shaming around cultural foods, and I'm just maybe interested in you expanding upon that a little bit. Are we talking about foie gras, white rice, sopapillas? What are we talking about? Tell me more.
Yeah, so I think that I come from Arizona and I am half Latina myself. And so sometimes it would just kill me when I would hear um, providers tell participants like, oh, beans, like you really need to like, change the way that you're cooking your beans or do this or try to make it healthier in this way instead of just recognizing that every food fits. And if it's a cultural food and significant to that person, their culture, their family, that they all fit. And we don't need to take that food and try to make it fit into the Eurocentric my plate that there is room for these cultural foods. Because when somebody tried to tell this client, it was the diabetes management group, and I just wanted to cry because I was like, if somebody told me not to eat beans, and this recipe has been passed down from my grandma to my dad, to me. And if somebody told me that, I would not listen to them and I probably would never go back. So how much good did that really do, right?
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Yeah.
Hi, this is Greg. I have a follow-up question to that. I think a lot of us in the room can kind of imagine how that conversation would go, but I'm curious if you can provide an example in that context. Say you are speaking with somebody, new diabetes diagnosis, you're doing a diet recall, and you see that there are areas for improvement, right? And a lot of it might be there might be a lot of culturally significant foods, based on your conversation with the family. How would you go about, the first thing that I think of is, okay, moderation in some form is going to be helpful in trying to like, okay, these foods can fit, but maybe not in the amounts that you're having them. So how might you go about that part of the conversation? Because I think a lot of us here are familiar with and are on board with the concept of all foods can fit. We don't have to say you have to get rid of those necessarily. Um, but how do you find yourself practically going about those kinds of conversations? Um, Even maybe examples of what you might say.
Yeah, so that's a really great question because, yeah, you do have the concept, but then it's like, how do we implement this into practice? Because it's something that you are interested in doing, but how does it work? And I would say that I always kind of go like upstream a little bit, so I like take it back a step. So when you're creating your materials, can you include those foods that are culturally significant when you're even creating the materials? So if you are doing a diabetes education, having foods that they typically eat, that that client typically eats on the handout, and then showing the portions that are appropriate, right? And then giving them the conversions or the tools that they need to use to know, like, how can I make this fit? And of course, always including it in the like can have. Not like in some of the worst examples that I've seen, it's like, do not ever eat this. Like, do not ever eat, like sopapillas somebody mentioned or something like that. Just having materials where they can pick it up and say like, oh my gosh, this is a food that I eat. It's familiar to me. This person like knows and is showing me how I can eat in a way that is mindful of both, my body and what it needs right now, but also balancing that cultural. So I would say that it's kind of starts with like the educational materials, right? Seeing your food representative in materials used in education and counseling, 100%. And showing them how they can fit. Does anybody else have any questions? Well, thank you so, so much for having me today, and sharing this time with me and asking such great questions. And I will pass it back to you, Ellen.
Yeah, thanks so much, Emily. And we'll make sure to send your presentation slides and all those really great resources that you had embedded as well in our own follow-up email. So look for that as well as your certificate for continuing education units. And unless anyone else has any questions or thoughts for our final lawn of 2025, um, we can call it a little early. Great. Like I said, look for the next 2026 series of lawn in the next month or so. We'll get those sent out as well as the follow-up email. And I hope everyone has a great holiday this week and next month. And we'll see you in the new year.